Introduction. Dysorthographia or the spelling difficulty is very closely associated with writing skill. Hence, it is a part of dysgraphia, but it could be dealt with as an individual difficulty. This individually itself expresses its prominence in writing for a better expression of the languages. And so, dysorthographia must be paid attention. Central auditory processing disorder is a hearing disorder in which the trouble lies not with the ears but with the brain. People with central auditory processing disorder have no difficulty hearing sounds, especially speech, but their brains don't interpret the sounds inputs correctly. That's why the disorder is sometimes summarized as an ear-brain coordination problem. CAPD affects as many as 2% to 5% of school-age children, and as many as half of the children are diagnosed as having a learning disability. Children with central auditory processing disorder often fail to recognize subtle differences between the sounds of different words, even though the words are clear and loud enough for them to hear. This inability to understand words often becomes worse in noisy environments, but is not as present in quiet environments. Properly detecting and diagnosing CAPD as early in a child's life as possible is crucial to avoid developmental delays, both social and academic. Early diagnosis is a key to ensuring that the condition is resolved, which is why it is important. If you have noticed any of the above symptoms in your children, to have their hearing professionally tested. Dysorthographia. What is dysorthographia? Dysorthographia is a learning disability characterized by an important and durable defect to assimilate grammatical rules. It affects phoneme conversation, segmentation of sentence elements, application of spelling rules, and grammar in varied proportions. The most common characteristics of dysorthographia writing disorder are spelling errors and writing problems, similar to dyslexics. Other particular writing problems: encoding, copying error words, savings in syllables. Example: seemingly, seem, arbitrary cuts of words, omission of needed letters. Example: baby, BB, liberty, liberty. Conjugation, grammar, and analytical errors. Slowness, hesitations, and a poverty of poor in writing. This disability often emerges after dyslexia but is not systematic. Causes of dysorthographia: neuroscience and especially neuropsychology has provided better knowledge of the mechanism of human language at a higher level in the general functioning of the brain. These mechanisms are very complex and involve numerous cerebral functions. Dyslexia and dysorthographia are due to a malfunction of these basic written languages mechanisms, particularly language functions proper, the specific networks for reading comprehension. The functions required to acquire and use language: attention, memory, concepts of space and time, sequential abilities, reasoning and abstraction skills, etc. Severe dyslexia, dysorthographia generally emerge in elementary school, while less severe forms can go unnoticed for longer and only be discovered later. Difficulties with spelling. Spelling requires more auditory and visual discrimination, sequence memory, analysis and synthesis, and integration simultaneously than perhaps any other skill. Thus, the majority of children with LD have trouble spelling. Spelling is a more difficult activity than reading because it requires the production of a correct sequence of letters. Reading, on the other hand, requires recognition of a set of symbols already displayed on the page. Recognition is usually an easier memory process than recall and production. For most problem spellers, recalling the correct sequence of letters is the major obstacle. The spelling of dyslexic students, for example, is often referred to as bizarre, in that the letters they write may not correspond in any way with the sounds within the word, or with the usual appearance of the word in print. For many low-achieving students, spelling continues to present a problem long after reading skills have improved. Most dyslexic adults report having major spelling difficulties, and they try to avoid situations where their weakness might be revealed. Many of the difficulties for both children and adults appear to stem from three main causes: poor phonological skills, poor visual imagery, and insufficient instruction. Phonological skills: children with spelling difficulties quite commonly have poorly developed or inefficiently applied phonological skills. They are weak in identifying component sounds within the words. They try to spell, and they are poor at linking sound sand syllables to the correct group of letters. Spelling an unfamiliar word by relating its sound values to another known word. Spelling by analogy requires adequate auditory skills and phonic knowledge. It also requires an efficient mechanism by which to retrieve relevant graphophonic information rapidly from long-term memory. For many children, the complex and confusing relationship between letter patterns and sounds in English may not be properly learnt unless specific teaching of these patterns is provided. There is abundant evidence to indicate that specific training in phonemic awareness coupled with explicit teaching of phonics has a positive impact on spelling and reading. This is not to suggest that the key to excellent spelling is phonics alone, because other strategies are also essential for dealing with regular words often found in the English language. Visual imagery. Even when children do manage to reach the phonetic stage of spelling development, usually much later than normal spellers, they appear unable to move beyond it because they do not use visual strategy efficiently to help store image of words in visual memory, or to judge whether a word looks correct or incorrect after they have written it. Many years ago, Johnson and Michael Bust, 1967, referred to this as an inability to revisualize words, and they devised a teaching procedure that caused the learner to focus more attentively on the sequence of letters to help establish a clear visual image. Peters and Smith in 1993 and Richards 1999 also stressed the importance in training visual perception of words, forms, and letter sequences to ensure good development in spellings. The well-known look, say, cover, write, check strategy is one effective way of ensuring that visual imagery is applied to spelling. Insufficient instruction: learning to spell, like learning to read, is not a natural language process, so children need instruction. Poor spellers are not very adept at acquiring spelling skills merely through reading and other incidental means. They believe that children need to be taught effective word analysis and other strategies to help them become independent spellers. There is evidence that a brief but intensive intervention program with a focus on strategy for spelling and word analysis can have positive effects on the spelling performance and motivation of children the primary school years. In general, the approach needs to address spelling improvement with a meaningful reading and writing program, not as a separate skill to be taught in isolation. However, there may be occasions on which the investigation of word families and spelling demons through the medium of mini lessons will be helpful for all students. Auditory processing disorder (APD) refers to how the central nervous system uses auditory information. However, the CNS is vast and also is responsible for functions such as memory, attention, and language, among others. To avoid confusing APD with other disorders that can affect a person's ability to attend, understand, and remember, it is important to emphasize that APD is an auditory deficit that is not the result of other higher order cognitive, language, or related disorder. There are many disorders that can affect a person's ability to understand auditory information. For example, individuals with attention deficit hyperactive disorder ADHD may well be poor listeners and have difficulty understanding or remembering verbal information. However, their actual neural processing of auditory input in the CNS is intact. Instead, it is the attention deficit that is impeding their ability to access or use the auditory information that is coming in. Similarly, children with autism may have great difficulty with spoken language comprehension. However, it is the high order global deficit known as autism that is the cause of their difficulties, not a specific auditory dysfunction. Finally, although the term language processing and auditory processing sometimes are used interchangeably, it is critical to understand they are not the same thing at all. For many children and adults with these disorders and others, including mental retardation and sensory integration dysfunction, the listening and comprehension difficulties we often see are due to higher order, more global, or all encompassing disorder and not to any specific deficit in the neural process of auditory stimuli per se. As such, it is not correct to apply the label APD to these individuals, even if many of their behaviors appear very similar to those associated with APD. In some cases, however, APD may coexist with ADHD or other disorders. In those cases, only careful and accurate diagnosis can assist in disentangling the relative effects of each. Around 5% of the total population of school-age children is affected by a weakness in auditory processing. Auditory processing refers to how a person's brain processes or interprets auditory information received from the environment, particularly speech sounds. Children with auditory processing disorder have difficulty discriminating similar spoken sounds or words following verbal direction, particularly those with more than one step, and often have trouble learning new material that is presented orally. APD, which is also sometimes referred to as central auditory processing disorder, can result in delayed language development behavior problems due to frustration caused by the inability to process information presented orally effectively and poor academic performance. Auditory processing weaknesses most often affect performance in the areas of reading and spelling where being able to interpret auditory information is crucial. Auditory processing disorder is commonly found among children with other learning disabilities and impairments such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Although it is not caused by those learning problems, auditory processing weaknesses are usually first noticed by parents, daycare providers, or teachers. Parents who suspect that the child has a weakness with auditory processing should consult the family doctor, who can rule out any other cause for the child's particular problem and make a referral for an audiologist evaluation. If necessary, an audiologist will complete testing to screening for a problem with hearing. In many cases, children who are suspected of having an auditory processing disorder will work with a speech language pathologist also to determine how well the child is using language. Because auditory processing disorder manifests in children across a wide spectrum of intensity, there is not one specific course of treatment or series of accommodations that can be used. Treatment and educational strategies should be tailored to meet the individual needs of each student. Children with auditory processing disorder often have trouble when there is great deal of noise in the background. So teachers should work to create an environment which has few auditory distractions as possible. Children with auditory processing disorder should be seated somewhere near where instruction is being delivered. Verbal direction should be simplified and clarified as needed, and many students respond well to written instructions and other visual cues in conjunction with verbal directions. Asking a student to repeat or paraphrase the direction after they have been delivered is another way to ensure that the student has heard properly. Children with APD may exhibit a variety of listening and related complaints. For example, they may have difficulty understanding speech in noisy environments, following directions, and discriminating or telling the difference between similar sounding speech sounds. They may behave as if a hearing loss is present, often asking for repetition or clarification. In school, children with APD may have difficulty with spelling, reading, and understanding information presented verbally in the classroom. Often their performance in classes that don't rely heavily on listening is much better, and they typically are able to complete a task independently once they know what is expected of them. However, it is critical to understand that these same type of symptoms may be apparent in children who do not exhibit APD. Therefore, we should always keep in mind that not all language and learning problems are due to APD, and all cases of APD do not lead to language and learning problems. APD cannot be diagnosed from a symptoms checklist. No matter how many symptoms of APD a child may have, only careful and accurate diagnostics can determine the underlying cause. Sensory processing disorder. Sensory processing disorder (SPD) is a disorder caused by immature nervous system development and coincides with many other diagnoses such as developmental delay, attention deficit disorder, also the hyperactivity type, learning disability, dyspraxia, apraxia, and executive functioning disorder is a very strong component of the profile of a child on the autism spectrum, for which there is a separate section on the website. Sensory processing disorder can also exist without any other diagnosis and is a hidden disability in many struggling learners today. Children with this disorder frequently are gifted intellectually, though never reach their full potential, and parents and teachers are puzzled by what they perceive the child's ability could be. But the level at which the child is performing at school and at home, many of these children are called lazy and underachievers, as if at will, yet is struggling with this underlying difficulty. It is very difficult for these children to identify what they are struggling with, since they only have one body and one nervous system and have no idea that the child next to them perceives incoming sensory information differently than they do. Children struggling with this disorder often suffer from poor self esteem, low frustration tolerance, and even emotional tantrums that seemingly are unexplained by themselves or the observers. Parents and therapists have been treating this disorder for years since Jean Ayer's famous work started in the early 60s. This work has stood the test of time and there is active research to support it. There are multiple children today who are getting the help they need, but there are many who are not, and this is a sad situation for the children and their families. What is sensory processing? Sensory processing is the ability to take in, sort out, and give meaning to information from the world around us. It is the neurological process of taking in sensory information, that is sound of someone's voice, clothes that you're wearing, the temperature of the room. It takes place automatically, instant reaction, and unconsciously in normal development as information is taken in through our senses, that is, touch, movement, sight, and sound. This is not a conscious or intentional process, but automatic process, and therefore we do not have to think about it on a daily basis. We simply access it and use it. Sensory integration theory was developed by Dr. A. Jean Ayers. She has provided us with a theoretical framework that links a neuroscience perspective in interpreting and understanding human behavior. The term sensory integration is now a term under the umbrella term of sensory processing to encompass a wide array of sensory difficulties, such as sensory modulation as well. Normal sensory processing and normal development coincides as developmental milestones are reached in a motor as well as social, emotional, and play development. Learning is dependent on the ability to take in, process, regulate, and integrate sensation from movement and the environment, and then use that information to plan and organize behavior or to do everyday activities. Sensory processing formed the framework for playing, learning, work, and self-care. Many individuals who have deficits in processing sensation also have deficits in producing appropriate actions, which interfere with learning and behavior. There are three components to consider when discussing an individual sensory processing ability: sensory modulation, sensory integration, and praxis. Sensory modulation is the capacity to regulate and organize the degree, intensity, and nature of sensory input, not over or under reactive response, in a graded and adaptive manner. This impacts an individual's ability to achieve and maintain an optimal range of attention for performance in activities such as play, social interactions, and learning. Behaviorally, this is mostly seen as a sensory seeking or a sensory avoiding type of response and is often misunderstood as stubborn, oppositional, or silly behavior. Sensory integration discrimination is concerned with how the different systems are discriminated different sensations as well as interacts with each other to achieve functional outcomes such as fine and gross motor skills as well as praxis ability. The other area that frequently is affected by sensory processing difficulties is praxis. This is the ability to conceive of, organize, plan, and carry out or execute an unfamiliar motor activity. It is the ability by which we physically and mentally figure out how to interact with people and objects in our environment. Praxis includes creating an idea, mentally sequencing, planning each step required to translate the idea into action, motor execution, or the actual performance of the plan, and adaptability or the ability to automatically adjust the motor plan as he or she is performing the action. This is a complex process performed at an unconscious level of the brain that is very important for efficient motor coordination, learning novel motor tasks like riding a bike, printing letters, play skills, turn taking, playing sports, and so on. Praxis ability is also considered to be a building block for higher order thinking skills, executive functioning, and sequencing tasks, which include memory, especially active working memory, organization skills, and attention. Higher order thinking skills are necessary for learning and process more intricate information and the development of more complex reasoning and sustained attention for learning. Therefore, difficulty with practices will directly impact academic functioning and those skills necessary for learning, processing, and reasoning information, such as reading, comprehension, and written expression. Conclusion. Dysorthographia is the name of both a brain disorder, a faulty brain state, and a series of symptoms, behaviors in the classroom, one being the cause of the other. Dysorthographia as a whole is endowed with causal value. If a child cannot write properly, it is because he is dysorthographic. But is this legitimate, and what does it explain? To begin with, is there such a thing as dysorthographia in the real world? It is doubtful. Some children experience difficulty in writing, and we name this dysorthographia. It follows that there is such a thing as dysorthographia, and dysorthographics form a category. These compounds are learnt constructions coined from Greek and Latin roots, and they purport to refer to clearly identified illnesses. As with all illnesses, it is implied that there is the possibility of a cure. Worried parents readily accept such categorizations because blaming an illness gives them hope of a solution. No doubt, educationalists, psychologists, and teachers will take the matter into their expert hands and do their utmost to help the children. Audio processing disorder can affect both children and adults, although the actual prevalence is currently unknown. It has been suggested that males are twice as likely to be affected by the disorder as females, but there are no good scientific studies. Sensory processing disorder, or SPD, is a hypothesized neurological disorder. While SPD is not yet recognized in standard medical manuals, the term SEES used by some practitioners and patients to refer to a range of difficulties with taking in, processing, and responding to sensory information about the environment and from within one's own body, like visual, auditory, tactile, olfaction, gustatory, vestibular. Thank you.